Greetings, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Beek. I coordinate adult education programs here at Trees Atlanta, and I'm so thankful that you're here today for the virtual Lunch and Learn on the impact of Southern Pine Beetles with University of Georgia's Gabrielle Latour. And also, I'd like to say thank you to Quinn, my colleague, who is here today to help us make sure that all of our questions are answered today. So for those of you all who do not yet know, Trees Atlanta is a 40-year-old nonprofit. This is our 40th year. We were started in 1985, and our mission has been to protect and improve Atlanta's urban forests through planting, conserving, and educating. And we invite you to check out our website because there's so many wonderful ways to get involved with planting trees throughout the city of Atlanta, conserving or doing restoration work, and education programs such as today's. We also want to thank our sponsors for today's program, the City of Atlanta. They make these free and accessible for so many of us, and we could not do urban forest education without them. For today's session, to make it as positive and efficient and interactive as possible through virtual learning, we ask you to drop any questions that you have into the Q&A, which can be found on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And then during the Q&A session, we'll be sharing your questions with Gabrielle. And if we happen to run out of time for some reason, we will always follow up in writing. There will be a recording of today's events, and we'll post it on YouTube at Trees Atlanta, where you can access it in the future. And then after today's session, we'll be sending a survey, and Gabrielle might have one as well. And those surveys really help us prepare better programs for you in the future. We realize that some of you all are also hoping to get some continuing education units if you're a part of the ISA. And at the end of today's session, Gabrielle is going to be sharing her screen with a QR code. And on that, you can take a picture of it with your phone and then enter your name and your certification number, and we'll make sure that we get those for you. We have some really wonderful other events that are coming up in addition. On Earth Day, we have a really fun workshop that we're doing at the studio of the crew of the Grateful Gluttons. And we'll be making giant acorn lanterns that people are invited to walk with along the Beltline Lantern Festival. On Saturday, April 26th, we have a really cool event. We're going to be doing a special screening of the Observer film with Dr. David George Haskell. And people who come, the first 50 get this great kit, and we'll be going outside on campus to use that kit to observe things. And then something that's really interesting that's coming up for me, is an author talk on mini forest revolution with Hannah Lewis. And she's going to be sharing about this tiny forest or mini forest revolution that is occurring in cities across the US, from New York to LA and right here in Atlanta, where people are planting these tiny forests to help sequester carbon and also rewild urban areas. So we encourage you to do that and check out our other events on our website. You can also find out more about what's happening at Trees Atlanta through our social media and signing up for our emails. And with that, I'm so excited to introduce Gabrielle Latour. She is our natural resource agent at UGA Extension. She is an entomologist by training and absolutely loves insects. I've learned so much from her over the years. She helps farms and gardens throughout Fulton County, and she's very passionate about closing the gap between people and their food. She works with farmers to make production more sustainable and profitable. In addition to that, she's very busy this spring coordinating Fulton County's Master Gardener program, which is an excellent resource, and I encourage you to check them out. She also oversees the North Fulton Community Garden and answers questions from clients and those of us who want to learn more from her. Her favorite insect is so cool. I encourage you to Google it as I did, the Pandora Sphinx moth. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction. Let me get mine popped up here. Okay, let's see. Can you see my screen and can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me back. If anybody was here for my spotted lanternfly talk a couple weeks ago, thank you and welcome back. We're going to be talking about something a little bit different today. That's southern pine beetles. And if you join this talk, you may have heard of southern pine beetles already. Last year was a really, really bad year for them. So maybe you had an experience with them last year, and we're going to talk all about them. So yes, I'm Gabriella Tora. I'm an agriculture and natural resources agent for UGA Extension's Fulton County office. And it won't let me advance. Here we go. For anybody who's not familiar with Extension, we are essentially the science translators for the University of Georgia, and we're stationed in every county in Georgia. We have an office that represents every county. I'm on the agriculture and natural resources team, but we also have a family and consumer sciences team that used to be called home economics. So that's kind of the things that they work on. They help people with financial planning education, nutrition education. They even do some tax prep. So they've been busy the last couple weeks. And our third program area is 4-H, which many of you may have heard about, or maybe you were a 4-H'er yourself. They are essentially our youth programming arm. So they take the agriculture and natural resources education, and they take the family and consumer sciences education, and they deliver those programs to a youth audience. So 4-H is amazing. I wish that I had been a 4-H'er. So if you have kids that you would like to be involved with 4-H, just get in touch with your county extension office. And I also want to note that the University of Georgia offers all of our educational programs, our assistance, and our materials to all people without regard to protected class. So here's what we're going to talk about today. What is southern pine beetle? And I'll be kind of switching back and forth between southern pine beetle and the abbreviation SPB. So that's what that means. We'll talk about kind of the context of why it's considered a problem, especially right now. We're going to go into excruciating detail about southern pine beetle natural history and the life cycle. Somebody told me they don't want to hear about the natural history and the life cycle. And so you can tell me at the end whether that section is helpful for you. Partly, I got really interested in it when I was prepping for this talk, and I just didn't realize they had such a cool natural history. But I think it also gives us some context for what they're doing, how they're interacting with our pines and with our forests. And it gives us that like basis of knowledge to understand what's going on. So I would love to hear if y'all like that section at the end, because I found it especially interesting. But then after that, we'll talk about what host species or what host pines are hosts for southern pine beetle. We'll talk about how you can recognize signs of an SPB infestation, which is going to be really important. And if you do identify an infestation in a pine tree on your property, what you can do. So what is southern pine beetle? We're looking at an adult right here on the right side of the screen. This is a teeny tiny beetle. The scientific name is Dendroctonus frontalis. It's a beetle, so it's in the order Coleoptera, and it's in the family Curculionidae, which includes all of our weevils and our bark beetles. This is a very, very small native bark beetle. And I put native in bold because, yes, it has massive impacts on our pines, which I'll talk about at length, but I think that the impacts that it has are kind of reminiscent of, or they remind us of, an introduced non-native species, but this is a native species of beetle. And so we'll talk about why it has some of these characteristics of having these big effects. It's super, super tiny, about 3 millimeters long as an adult. I'll show you a picture on the next slide that gives some context for how tiny it is. And it generally will be infesting this group of pine species that we call southern yellow pine. So that includes shortleaf pine, loblolly pine, slash pine, and a couple others. But virtually any pine species can be infested by southern pine beetle. They just kind of prefer pines in this southern yellow pine group. Despite being a native insect, it is considered the most economically significant forest pest in the Southeast. It alone has contributed to over $250 million in pine tree losses just in Georgia since the early 70s when we started monitoring for it. And it is a pest throughout the Southeast, so that number is just for Georgia. And I'll also note that it's much more of an economic issue for commercial foresters and pine plantations. I'm assuming that most people in the audience are residents, homeowners, maybe you have pine trees on your property. And yes, your pine trees can become infested with southern pine beetle as well. But in economic terms, this is a much bigger issue for commercial pine plantations. And so a lot of the information and the recommendations that you'll find online are more for this like commercial pine production type system. So just to put that into some context. So here's our little guy, southern pine beetle on top of a penny. So that's how tiny they are. You probably will never see a pine beetle adult. There's like one time where you might see them, which I'll show you a picture of later towards the end of the talk. And so that's why it's really, really important to get to know what the symptoms and signs of their infestation on the trees look like, because they're just so small. And they spend a lot of their time inside of the trees anyway, so you most likely will never see them. If you do, there's like hundreds of bark beetle species and they all look like that to me. If there's any taxonomists in the audience, you're probably like pulling your hair out, but they all kind of have that look. So it would be hard to identify it if you did find an adult anyway. So why is it a problem? Normally, remember I mentioned that this is a native species, so it's been evolving with our native pines in this part of the world for millennia. So under normal circumstances, this is a secondary pest that is attacking mostly stressed pine trees. So things that can stress out pine trees are a lot of natural factors. So mechanical damage from lightning strikes, from storm and wind damage, from naturally occurring diseases, droughts, floods, but also human causes. So in our commercial pine productions, we've got high stand density, typically of all one species, which has its own issues ecologically also, but potentially like poor thinning practices. And so when we pack a bunch of trees together, that can stress them if they're not getting the space and the resources that they need. So historically, this is a secondary pest that attacks stressed trees. It also is competing with like hundreds of other bark beetle species and other insects that are also attacking stressed trees. So that competition can really keep the southern pine beetle population in check, just like our ecology works that way, a system of checks and balances. But when conditions are right, when we've got this confluence of optimal conditions, we can actually see outbreaks of this pest. And so we call these spots. You might see that in the literature. This is when multi-acre swaths of pine trees become infested with southern pine beetle, that can result in like thousands of acres of dead pine trees. Some of these spots can last for multiple years in a row if they get really bad. Typically, a spot will start when pine beetles infest one stress tree, right? And then we'll talk about this too, they employ this kind of mass attack strategy where like thousands of beetles fly into this one tree. And so once that tree is kind of at capacity for the beetles, they'll move on to immediately adjacent trees and then keep moving out. And so because of that, we get this spread like in one particular direction or in multiple directions at once of infested trees that eventually die. And so they've kind of got this leading edge. We have like a central point and they're expanding out from there. When we have really, really bad infestations, we can see this area expanding up to 50 feet per day. So they can have massive effects like pretty quickly. Generally, since we've been recording spots and monitoring for this insect since the 70s, they kind of have a cyclical nature. So, like a lot of things that we see in nature, we'll see outbreaks kind of in a cyclical pattern. According to monitoring data in the Piedmont region of Georgia, we will typically see SPB outbreaks every 6 to 10 years. In the more mountainous regions of North Georgia, we'll see it closer to like every 12 years. And in 2023, we saw a really big increase from, average of a couple spots a year to 273 reported spots. And then we saw another massive increase last year in 2024 of over 1,600 spots that were recorded. And so I asked our UGA forest entomologist, why did we see so many spots in 2024? And she kind of gave the ecologist answer of like many interacting and complex factors involved. So really, like, we can chalk it up to high planting density on these pine plantations, which stresses trees. We may have poor thinning practices, and so we've got a lot of the same species in monoculture all in one place. The trees might be stressed. And then if y'all remember last year, we had a really devastating drought right in the middle of the summer. And so that put massive stress on trees. So I think those factors combined with like the cyclical nature of outbreaks of this pest kind of combined to like a really bad year last year. And I know in the Fulton County Extension Office, we got a lot of calls about southern pine beetle last year. So we'll see what happens this year. And so here's the part where I get into the nitty-gritty about the natural history of this insect. We'll start with kind of how they find and colonize their host trees. So female beetles are they send out some sentinels. We call these pioneer beetles, and they're out there searching for suitable host trees. So typically they're going to be looking for trees that are stressed, where they know with this mass attack strategy, they can overcome the tree's defenses. And so once these sentinel females find a stressed tree that they deem to be a suitable host, they start releasing aggregation pheromones. And this works to bring in and attract hundreds and thousands of other southern pine beetles that happen to be in the area. So they all fly into this one tree. They all start chewing with their little chewing mouth parts through the outer bark and trying to get into the tree. So, like I said, this is a native species and it's evolved with pines over thousands and thousands of years. And so pine trees have their own defenses, right? So as soon as an insect, southern pine beetle, starts chewing on the tree, the pine tree starts releasing resin, which you can see as these pitch tubes. That's what we call it. Pine tree resin we call pitch. And so the pitch essentially will it'll attempt to stop the beetles. So the beetles might get stuck in the pitch. They might suffocate and die in the pitch. But ultimately, a beetle will be able to get into the tree if it can excavate through that pitch faster than the tree is releasing pitch, right? And so when we've got all these thousands of beetles flying in, they're all chewing into the tree at once, that can have the overall effect of sort of overwhelming the tree's defensive capabilities. And especially if we had a drought, we need water. The tree needs water in order to produce this pitch. And so when we have a drought, trees are already at a disadvantage to be able to produce enough pitch to keep the beetles out. And so ultimately the scales might tip one way or another. Individual beetles might not be able to get in, but we might see that beetles are able to overcome the tree's defenses ultimately. Once the beetle density reaches some maximum for this tree, then beetles that are still flying in that are attracted by this aggregation pheromone will start moving to adjacent trees that are really, really close to, like, right next to this tree, okay? Um, and so that's kind of how we see this outbreak, the spots spreading with this leading edge. So males and females will, as soon as they get through the outer bark, they'll kind of chew this, what we call a nuptial chamber, very romantic. And something that I found in the literature is that we actually consider southern pine beetles to be monogamous because we only typically find one male and one female in a given gallery, which I thought was very sweet. So as soon as they chew through the outer bark, they sort of chew this nuptial chamber and they mate. That's like the first thing that they do just inside the tree. And then let me move my camera over. So then if you see this picture on the right, the female will begin chewing and constructing this serpentine and branchless gallery that she's going to lay her eggs in. So she's the one that's constructing this gallery. The male that she just mated with is following behind her, and he's cleaning out any debris. He's cleaning out any frass, which is insect poop. So he's cleaning up, which is very nice. They're doing some teamwork there. And then once she's got her gallery, she starts cutting these little egg niches. So little chambers just off of the main gallery. She deposits a single egg in each one of those egg niches and she packs it tight with sawdust. So it's like nice and comfy and cozy in there, nice and warm. She also does something cool. Bark beetles are just like amazing to me. She will deposit spores of specialized mycangial fungi. And so just like the beetles have been evolving with these pine species, the beetles have been evolving alongside these particular species of mycangial fungi. And a lot of bark beetles do this. It's not unique to southern pine beetle, but the species of fungus that's associated with a species of bark beetle, that will be different. They're really tight evolutionary relationships, which is cool. And actually, the females have a special structure on their back called a mycangium that holds the fungal spores. So it's kind of like a backpack that she's carried spores from the tree where she was born to her new tree where she's laying the eggs. So she sort of unpacks these fungal spores and she deposits those throughout the gallery. And they act as sort of like a nutritious secondary food source for her larvae once they hatch. So the fungus will start to proliferate inside of these galleries, and it's almost like a little salad bar for her larvae once they hatch. So after she's created these galleries, she laid her eggs in these little egg niches. She and the male that she mated with, they leave. They just bore their way out of the tree, and presumably they die after that. After about 3 days to a couple weeks, depending on temperature, the eggs will hatch into larvae, which are immature insects. And these larvae start to feed. The main priority of southern pine beetle larvae is just to feed. That's like the number one thing that they want to do, just like human children. They just want to eat and get bigger and grow. And so they start carving their way off out of their egg niches and creating these side galleries. Excuse me. And so that kind of expands the damage within the tree the more that they chew, right? They're disrupting cambium tissue, they're disrupting phloem, which is right in that part of the tree as well. They go through 4 specific molts, what we call instars. As they feed, they get bigger, but because they have an exoskeleton, they have to molt in order to continue getting larger. And so meanwhile, they're feeding throughout the cambium layer, they're feeding throughout the phloem, they're feeding on these tissues as well as the mycangial fungi that is in the galleries. Once they feel like they have fed enough, which is typically like a couple more weeks, they will chew their way to the outer bark where they construct a pupal cell that's kind of oblong, and that's where they pupate. So this pupal stage, some people call it a resting stage, but they're not really resting. They're completing this dramatic transformation from this little worm-like larva into an adult. And they construct these pupal chambers right in the outer bark so that when they molt into their adult form after another few days or a couple weeks, they can just bore their way out. And so they leave and then they go to attack another tree, and the cycle continues. So some big picture things about their natural history. Here in Georgia, we have about 7 generations of southern pine beetle a year. It could be fewer up in the north part of the state where it's a little bit colder. But because we've got this many generations, we've got different development times in different parts of the state where the climate conditions are different. The net result is that we really have like a continuous presence of southern pine beetle adults in the forest environment throughout the summer and fall. So they're going to really start getting active in like mid to late spring, and then the populations really pick up in the summer and fall. And all of this tunneling, some from the adults that are entering the tree, but mostly from the larval activity, it disrupts the cambium layer, it disrupts the phloem, which is really important. I mean, phloem takes all those photosynthates, the carbohydrates and the sugars that are produced by the leaves through photosynthesis, and then transmits them throughout the tree. That's the tree's food, right? And so all of this tunneling disrupts the phloem tissue, and that essentially girdles the tree. On top of that, the southern pine beetles and some secondary attacking insects, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, introduce a contaminant that is blue stain fungi and other things. And that can clog up the xylem tissue, which is the specialized tree tissue that brings water and minerals up from the roots and distributes those throughout the tree. So that kind of exacerbates this girdling effect of the tree. The net effect is that a pine that's attacked by southern pine beetle will probably die, especially when we've got like big populations and we've got these additional stressors in the environment. But like I've said multiple times now, this is a native species with a long history of coevolution with the beetles or with the beetles and the pines. And so, you know, if historically, if southern pine beetles always killed pine trees, then we wouldn't have any southern yellow pine species, right? So we'll get into this later. Conditions today are a little bit different than they have been in the evolutionary past of these beetles and pines. But you know, we can think about the pines have evolved chemical and physical defenses against the beetles to keep them out. In turn, the beetles have adapted to be able to get through some of those chemical defenses. And so we see this like evolutionary push and pull between these guys. So some host species of southern pine beetle I kind of touched on already. They prefer loblolly and shortleaf pine. They will also attack pitch, pond, Virginia pines, slash pines, but almost any pine species can and will be attacked by southern pine beetle given the right conditions. Stress is really, really important when it comes to making trees more susceptible to southern pine beetle. So, you know, like I mentioned, a stressed tree is typically like ground zero for an SPB spot. And so things like, you know, like I mentioned, physical damage from storms or lightning or wind damage, drought conditions, flooding conditions, as well as some of these commercial pine management activities like high stand density, pore thinning practices. That kind of thing can really it can stress trees and make them a lot more susceptible to southern pine beetle infestation. Okay, so I harped and moaned already about this is a native species and their evolutionary push and pull. But like I teased a second ago, the ecological landscape that we see today and the interactions between southern pine beetle and these pine species, it looks a lot different than how it historically has throughout the evolutionary history of these beetles and the pines. And so before Europeans arrived in North America, in the Southeast, we saw a lot of old growth forests that were dominated by late successional species like oaks, hickories, chestnuts, as well as longleaf pine, which is a late succession pine species. Um, Once Europeans colonized this region, they converted a lot of these old growth forested areas into agricultural production. Okay, so we're cutting down old growth forests. We might be depleting soils as well. And then a lot of these agricultural areas converted into no longer being used for agricultural purposes. They may have been abandoned or let to go fallow, something like that. And so we see this forest succession system taking place, this process. And so we end up with a lot of these areas being colonized by early succession tree species like loblolly and shortleaf pine. On top of that, we've removed fire from a lot of these areas, which historically fire was present in these old growth forests. And if anybody is familiar with longleaf pine ecosystems, they are fire dominated ecosystems. And so when we remove fire, we essentially prevent the forest from being able to succeed into that successional stage. And so that allows the proliferation of these early succession pine species like loblolly and shortleaf pine that are more susceptible to southern pine beetle. On top of all that, we have extensive pine production in the Southeast. So like I mentioned before, we've got these massive monocultures of these susceptible early succession pines all together, tightly packed. And so all of these factors kind of come together to show us that we've got an ecological landscape that kind of facilitates southern pine beetle outbreaks, where before we had a lot more checks on southern pine beetle in the ecosystem. Okay, so some signs to look out for. Like I mentioned before, these beetles are so tiny and they kind of look like other bark beetles and they spend a lot of time in the trees. So you probably will never see an adult southern pine beetle and have the opportunity to identify it. So the best thing that you can do is get to know some of these signs and symptoms on the tree so that you can use those to identify whether you've got an infestation. The first and kind of most obvious symptom that you're going to see is what we call a fading crown. So that's like dieback in the canopy of the pine tree, right? So typically healthy foliage is green, the needles are nice and green. They'll kind of turn yellow at first, then they turn red, and then they turn brown and they get crispy and die and fall off. Sometimes with an infested tree, we'll see green needles falling off, which is kind of unusual. And so if I go back a couple slides, nope, wrong way. Couple slides, this shows an extensive SPB spot. So we can see like out here, these healthy green pines have not been infested yet, but the most recently infested pines are starting to turn yellow. And then the ones that were infested a little earlier than those are now turning red. And then we've got the ones that were infested earliest are now brown and like crispy. So keep an eye on the crown of your trees. I will say not every pine that is dying or has dieback in the canopy is infested with southern pine beetle. So you want to look for some secondary characteristics to help you make an accurate identification. So the other most common thing that you're going to see are those pitch tubes that I mentioned. So when the beetles start boring in, the tree starts releasing resin, what we call pitch, and we get these little globs of pitch on the outside of the tree. Typically with southern pine beetle, we're gonna see these pitch tubes like in the crevices and in the grooves between these bark panels. They kind of look, some people say they look like popcorn. I think they kind of look like wads of gum. You will most likely see them about 15 to 20 feet up on the trunk of the tree. That's where the highest densities of SPB are going to be. But as the tree becomes more infested and the population builds inside that tree, we'll see these pitch tubes coming down. So binoculars really help to keep an eye on these. If we've got any birders in the house, I'm a birder, I've got my binoculars over here. You know, I got my binos on me at all times. So yes, binoculars are really helpful for checking these out. And these pitch tubes are really characteristic of southern pine beetles for whatever reason. So keep an eye out for those. Especially if you've got pitch tubes down below and this tree has been infested for a while, you can peel these layers of bark back really easily. It's harder to do like the earlier that it's been infested because the tree hasn't like completely given up yet. But if you're able to peel these back, you might be able to see some of these serpentine galleries just under this outer bark, because that's where these beetles are feeding. If you end up removing your tree, you might be able to look under there and see them too. So that's going to be kind of your third symptom that you can use to characterize a southern pine beetle infestation. Here's a couple more pictures of the pitch tubes. So again, I think this really like looks like globs of gum or something, and you can see it in the crevices between these layers of bark. Elizabeth McCarty, our forest entomologist at UGA, sent me this picture, and I thought this was cool because you can actually see a southern pine beetle that got trapped in the pitch when the tree was exuding this pitch. And so, you know, this beetle didn't make it in, and that sort of goes back to my point of like, not every beetle is going to make it in, but the net effect is either going to be the beetles don't get in or they do and they kill the tree. I did mention this a little bit before, but other insects are going to be attracted to these stressed trees, whether it's from the aggregation pheromones from the southern pine beetles or the trees are releasing volatiles after they have started to become infested. Whatever it may be, there's a lot of other insects that are attracted to this situation and will fly in to try and take advantage of the smorgasbord that's happening. And so we'll see things like ambrosia beetles. Some of you may be familiar with ambrosia beetles already. These are another species of bark beetle, and they have these characteristic, like almost toothpicks of sawdust that come out of the tree when they're boring their way out. So these little tubes of sawdust are really characteristic for ambrosia beetles. We'll also see Ips engraver beetles. They leave these little exit holes, and you'll see these kind of red accumulations of sawdust sometimes with Ips engraver beetles too. You'll also see black turpentine beetle evidence. They are Dendroctonus species as well, just like our southern pine beetle. You might see pine sawyers coming in. And you'll even see predator insects like this clarid beetle that are flying in to take advantage of all these wood-boring insects and actually prey upon them. So you can see this clarid beetle has a southern pine beetle in its mouth. So you don't need to be an entomologist. I'm not expecting you to know all the signs and symptoms of all these different insects. But my takeaway here is that you really need to get to know these characteristics so you can tell if there's southern pine beetle specifically there at that tree, but just know that you might see some other signs of other insects at the site too. Okay, so what to do? The first and best thing you can do if you're a homeowner or a resident with pine trees on your property, maybe you have a specimen tree that you really love, is really do all you can to promote health and vigor for that tree. So that means not planting them too close. It means making sure that they've got the right sunlight, they've got the right drainage for that species. If we go through periods of drought, that like we did last year, that was pretty intense, making sure that we're giving supplemental irrigation to the trees. Really get to know what species of pine you have and practice some of these right plant, right place principles, right? Give it its basic needs that are specific to that species that you have. And everything you can do to sort of promote a healthy tree will give you the best chance of sort of resistance to southern pine beetle. If you do think that you have an infestation in one or several of your trees, the first thing you want to do is contact a certified arborist. I recommend contacting what's called a consulting arborist. These are the guys that will come out and make an accurate identification and then give you the best advice for how to remove your trees and the course of action there. The International Society of Arborists has this website, treesaregood.org. They have a great directory tool where you can look up an arborist in your area and call around. So definitely use that directory if you're looking for a certified arborist. The Georgia Forestry Commission also has county foresters and they have forest health specialists that I know they will come out to commercial pine operations. I'm not positive that they will come out to a homeowner situation, but their website, which is right here, gatrees.org, has a lot of good resources and you can get in touch with their county foresters and forest health specialists there. So definitely check that out. But generally, if one of these people has determined that you have southern pine beetle infesting one or more of your trees, you will need to remove the trees. In a residential context, that's partly because these trees are going to die, and that becomes a hazard to you, to your neighbors, to your structures, to your property. And so the earlier that you can remove them, the better in terms of risk management. But you also want to create a little buffer and remove any pine trees surrounding that area. Remember, when we've got an infestation in one tree, the beetles are going to be jumping right to the next tree, and they're flying. They're not jumping, but they're not like spreading out really far. They're going to be moving right to the trees in the surrounding area. And so if we can create a buffer of like 20 or 50 feet where there's no pines, that'll go a long way in sort of capping an infestation and keeping it from spreading. Our forest entomologist did say we don't have to remove the tree material from the property, which I was a little bit surprised about. But the reasoning there is that these beetles do a lot better in living trees. And so, they're feeding on the phloem. Once we cut that tree down, it's not really a great habitat for the beetles for much longer. And so, especially if we've got a buffer of trees around that dead material, they really don't have anywhere to go. And so it's okay to leave them on site as long as we've got a buffer around that material. You can chip them, you can remove them. Again, this is a native species, so it's not like we're ever going to eradicate them. That buffer is really the key. And the other thing is that insecticides are not considered to be effective. They're not recommended either for homeowners or commercial foresters. So really what you want to do first is promote healthy and vigorous trees through your management practices. And if you make sure you know the signs and symptoms so you can identify an infestation early. And if you do confirm an infestation, remove the tree as soon as possible, or I guess take it down and make sure that you've got a buffer around that tree. Here are some good resources for you. UGA's Warnell School of Forestry put together this Southern Pine Beetle in Georgia fact sheet. So you can scan that QR code and get to that. It's got a lot of good basic information about what Southern Pine Beetle is and what you can do to manage it. Like I mentioned, Georgia Forestry Commission has a lot of good resources and they have contacts as well that you can talk to. This publication, Natural History of the Southern Pine Beetle, if you liked the section about their natural history and their life cycle, this goes into like even more excruciating detail about that. I found that article to be really, really interesting. And Clemson has this Southern Pine Beetle Information Center, and they've got a lot of really good resources there too. Remember, this is not just a Georgia issue, it's an issue throughout the Southeast. And so there's a lot of information out there for you. I'm happy to take any questions. If you want to contact me, please do. This is my contact information here. Email is the best way to reach me, but you're welcome to call my number as well. I'm just not in the office every day. So if you give me a call and leave me a message when I'm not there, I will call you back. And like Elizabeth mentioned, I know Trees Atlanta is going to be sending you a survey, but I very humbly ask you to take my survey as well, which is on this QR code on the right. It'll take less than 5 minutes to do. I really just want to know what of this information is most impactful to you and how I can improve, my talks for the future, what you want to hear about. So feel free to scan this and do it later. You can do it right after the talk if you want, but I would really appreciate your time filling that out. And I'll leave this up for just one more second. Like Elizabeth mentioned, you can get CEUs if you're a certified arborist. This is the QR code to go to the sheet where you can fill out your information. So I'll leave that up there, and I think that's really all the information I have, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. That was really, really informative. I learned so much from you. Um, Quinn and I would love anybody who has questions to go ahead and drop it into the Q&A or even into the chat, and we can share those with Gabrielle and get some answers for you. One of the questions that came in, you really, I feel like, covered. So I'm going to read it to you still, but I believe that you got this earlier and really integrated it quite well into your presentation today. If there's anything in addition that you want to add or say, you can, but they were asking if the trees could release a toxic substance, which you did go over, to kill the beetles and larvae, and why it was not effective, which you said it can be, as we saw in that one photo of the pine beetle kind of being in the resin, and sometimes it gets in. And what about the hormones to warn the unaffected trees? You covered that as well. Is there anything else that you want to add in addition to the great information that you already shared about that?
Sure. So I will just, I'll qualify this by saying I'm not a tree physiologist. I'm an entomologist by training. And so I know that the main way that these trees fight back against the southern pine beetle, so to speak, is is kind of this physical mechanism of releasing the pitch. I don't know if there are like specific chemicals in the pitch that have an effect on the beetles, and I don't know if the trees are releasing pheromones or communicating through their roots, which we know that trees do. I really don't know what the physiology is there. I think that from what I understand, their main way that they fight back against the beetles is by physically trapping them in this pitch and kind of trying to keep them out by releasing resin. But I think there's probably some information out there, like in actual research articles. I didn't come across anything like that through, extension publications and fact sheets and things, but it's a really cool question. And I bet that the trees have all types of complex chemical and physical ways to keep not just these beetles, but lots of other insects out.
Oh, thank you. Another question was, I live on 9 acres of mixed forest. The destruction has been catastrophic. what can I do to slow or halt the loss of trees? And I think you did cover those. And I don't know if you just want to summarize anything else. Um,
Yeah, definitely. So, like I mentioned before, I got a lot of questions similar to this person's um experience last year, especially in residential properties of like they lost a lot of trees. And so I think the best thing you can do first is monitoring. So making sure that you know the signs and symptoms and you're looking out for them, because the earlier that you can notice some of these signs and that you can get an arborist in there to identify this as a southern pine beetle infestation or not, it could be something else is going on. The earlier you can remove those trees, which is sad. It's not great to have to remove trees that you really care about on your property. Um, but the earlier you can kind of stop the infestation from spreading even farther. And, this isn't much of a consolation, but like I talked about, a lot of these pine species are what we would consider early succession forest species. And I know I didn't really get into like the theory of forest succession, but the idea is that a lot of these pines, they may be long-lived species, but they're not meant to, in a natural ecosystem, they don't persist in this same community. Some of these pines, loblolly, shortleaf pine, are some of the earlier trees to establish in a forest ecosystem after some disturbance. And then they eventually kind of give way to longer lived late succession species. And so, again, this isn't very much consolation, but a lot of these trees are not really meant to be permanent structures in a forest ecosystem. And so that's part of the reason they're like especially susceptible. It's just kind of the give and take um, of our southern forest ecosystems. And so, again, keep your eyes peeled, make sure that you're scouting your trees, and the earlier you can remove them and create that buffer, the better. If you have like not that many trees on your property, make sure that you're really giving them their basic needs and you're making them as healthy as possible, because that will also make them more tolerant or like resistant, not as attractive to southern pine beetle.
Thank you so much. So this came up, and the question was, there are no prevention actions we can take. My loblolly is 10 feet away from my neighbors. No infestation yet, I don't think, but any tips on navigating a situation in which one or both are affected? Any assistance that the state city offers to private trees that need to be removed? Are there any? I
That's a
think,
good question.
yeah.
I've gotten a few questions similar, like of people that don't have the ability or the means to remove trees. I have not found a city program right in the metro area that will help people remove trees. That's not to say that it doesn't exist. I just haven't come across it. I would say keep your eyes peeled for the symptoms. Bring in an arborist as soon as possible if you notice something, and they can give you the best advice about what to do with the tree. Um, I think, some of these basic like tree care things I already talked about. Yeah, just keep an eye on it is kind of my best advice. Definitely contact Georgia Forestry Commission. Their website is gatrees.org. Like I said, I don't know if they will send their county foresters out to residential properties. They may. I'm not sure. I know that they will send people out to commercial properties. So get in touch with them. That's something I probably should have found out a definitive answer to before now, and I apologize. I will be looking into that later, but yeah, please contact them too.
And we can follow up with some of that information as well. And it does sound like just, watering the tree if we go through a drought and all those kind of best practices to make the tree as strong as possible will help prevent the beetle from coming in.
Absolutely. And I also didn't get into specific care requirements for the different pine species because they vary a little bit. Like I know that loblolly actually kind of likes poor soils and it likes poor drainage from what I understand. And so just do a little research about what, if you have pine trees that you care about on your property, do a little research about what pine species you have, and also what conditions that particular species likes. And the more that you can kind of match those conditions, the healthier you can help the tree to be.
Thank you. When you say the infected trees can be left on site after being cut, the adults will die in the dead wood. When you talk about the buffer zone, you mean 50 feet in all directions of the trees that are not pines?
Yes. Yes to all of that. The beetles will have a hard time getting, if we have this buffer zone of like a nice, like again, your arborist can give you specific recommendations, but if we have a good buffer, the beetles are so tiny, they're going to have a hard time finding a suitable host after that. It's not to say they can't, it just reduces the likelihood that they're going to be able to spread.
Okay, and then I just had a follow-up question, and I think it with the adults will die in the dead wood, which you said. So for those of us who often get wood chips donated from trees and put them on our gardens or our pathways in our farms, we're not spreading anything in case we get a pine tree that was affected. Mulch.
Sure. I think it's unlikely, again, like I said, this is a native insect, and so
Yeah.
it's not like they're around, they're just around. And so when we have this confluence of environmental and physical conditions, we might see higher populations. So whatever we can do to like minimize risk, the better. If you're getting wood mulch, we typically recommend that it's like you compost it for a little while. That can definitely help. But again, like you're not really spreading them. They're already present in the ecosystem. Yeah, maybe spreading pine mulch can maybe introduce them. I'm not going to say that for sure, but we can, if you compost your mulch before you spread it, you'll have a better chance of reducing that spread, I think.
Okay, thank you. Let me see. We also had a speaker earlier this week that was kind of talking about how trees in his neighborhood were being stressed out more due to climate change. Um, are these prevention and kind of right tree, right place even more important as we deal with things like climate change and our trees becoming more stressed and vulnerable?
I think so. I mean, loblolly and shortleaf pines have kind of a wide range and geographically. And so I think we don't need to worry as much about with these particular species with changes in temperature, but like you said, practicing sort of these right plant, right place principles can go a long way. Getting to know what species of plants you have on your property and what conditions that particular species likes is really important. So I think given climate change, yes, getting to know the needs of your particular plants is really important and working to provide those. I always say like a healthy plant is a strong plant is a resistant plant. And this isn't just unique to southern pine beetle. It's unique to all of the ornamentals and the natives that we grow in sort of a gardening context. When you can meet those basic needs of that particular species, you create more of a resistant plant that is tolerant to all these insects that are out there. So yeah, I think doing a little research on your species and maybe making some habitat modifications to make your plants as strong and healthy as possible is a good general practice.
Well, thank you so much. Those are all the questions that we have for you at this point. And this was just a wonderful lunch and learn, and we love working with you. Um, so yeah, and we did get something in the chat that said that they really enjoyed the natural history piece. So wanted to
Very good.
give you that.
Thank you so, so much. And yeah, feel if you have additional questions, feel free to contact me here. If I don't know the answer, I can find somebody who does, or I can do some research. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle, and thank you all for being a part of this. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.
Bye.